Well, God bless you all. I'm always a little bit suspicious of the standing ovation before I speak. It's got to be downhill from here. My heart is just filled with gratitude as I look out at this crowd. I mean, first to Cardinal Nichols for allowing us to have this event. Of course, to Brendan, who's just been nothing but wonderful as he's arranged, as you heard, through all these trials and tribulations. To Joe Ronan, of course, at Catholic Voices, everybody at Catholic Voices. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Let me tell you something as I commence. When we were flying over here, we're arriving on a Sunday. So I said, well, our team has to go to Mass. And so I asked Brendan, where can we go that would be sort of interesting place to celebrate Mass? And he listed several options. And I had been to all the places except one. And the one I had not been to was the Tyburn convent. So I said, how about we go there? Well, what a providence that was. Because, I've been following that story much of my life. I know about the Tyburn tree and the Tyburn martyrs and so on. But we got there, and it was so moving to me to be in that place. And as we gathered for the Mass, we said Mass, and then I realized only afterwards that above the altar there is a reproduction of the Tyburn gallows, where all these martyrs died. Well, here's what's been in my heart really all this week. Because I realize every time I come to the UK, I realize how alive the 16th century is in the minds of Catholics. How important that moment was, drawing courage from these people. What if, think of Edmund Campion, or Ralph Sherwin, or Oliver Plunkett, as they were facing their execution, if the Lord had given them this vision, if they could have said, in the year 2023, in the shadow of Westminster Abbey, there'd be 1,500 enthusiastic Catholics gathered to celebrate their faith publicly. Well, we've drawn strength, haven't we, from their courage and their witness. That's very much in my heart as I commence reflecting with you today. Last October, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council. So the greatest religious event for Catholics, certainly in the last century. I've said for a long time, I think the vision of Vatican II, as splendid as it is still to a large degree unrealized. And that's for all kinds of reasons. But one of the ways I think particularly it's not realized is in the universal call to holiness and the missionary task of the laity in the world. We've used that language for a long time. I grew up with that language, but I wonder whether it's really reached down into the hearts and minds of Catholics. The laity find their holiness precisely through Christifying the world. A mentor to me was the great Cardinal George of Chicago. I don't know if you know him over here. He died back in 2015, but he was a great mentor, teacher to me. He always said Vatican II was a missionary council. Its purpose was not so much to modernize the church. Its purpose was to Christify the world, to bring the lumen to the gentes. Remember Lumen Gentium, the great document on the church. But the lumen there is not the church. The lumen, the light, is Christ. Now, how do we bring that light to the world? And for Vatican II, the principal vehicle of that communication, you, the laity. Vatican II wanted great Catholic lawyers, great Catholic politicians, great Catholic writers and educators, great Catholic business leaders, family members, etc., etc. The seculum, Vatican II said, the secular order, that's your arena. And the laity are meant now to invade that arena and Christify it. Well, in my judgment, everybody, that's still a largely unrealized vision. I still think a lot of the laity in our church don't realize that's their extraordinary, very powerful and indispensable vocation. Two great biblical images come to mind here. One is Noah's Ark. And, the church fathers love to use Noah's Ark as a symbol of the church. One reason why a lot of our churches look like great ships, right? The central section is called the nave, navis, the boat. Noah's Ark, where a concentration of God's good order is preserved, even during a time of chaos. But the minute the ark comes to rest, Noah opens the windows, the doors, to let out the life. That's you. On the ark, think now of the liturgy, think of the teaching of the church, think of the art and the saints of the church. That's where a microcosm of God's good order is preserved. But now, go, the priest says at the end of Mass, right? Go, the Mass is ended, go in peace to love and serve the Lord, go in peace to spread the gospel. Let out the life. Let out the life. Here's a second image now from the very end of the Bible. We go from first book to last book. When the heavenly Jerusalem descends, remember the book of Revelation, and it's the gates of pearl, the streets of gold. But the most remarkable thing about the heavenly Jerusalem is there's no temple in it. You think, well, that's odd, isn't it? Because the temple was the main reason why people came to the earthly Jerusalem. Why is there no temple? Well, because the whole city has become a temple. The temple is the place of right praise. Well, now, think of a city. Art and science and business and politics and sports and entertainment, all that goes on in the city, all of it now turned toward the Lord in right praise. The whole city is a temple. That's your job. That's the job of the laity, is to turn the city of London or of New York or LA or whatever city you want to choose, to turn that city into a temple. That's your job. That's your responsibility. That, I think, is the Vatican II vision. When I was growing up, we often use the language of modernizing the church, but that's just not it. We might have made some modernizations in order to facilitate Christification. That's the goal. That's what Vatican II is about. Okay, a figure that I've been actually referencing a lot this week as I've gone through London to different audiences, and I didn't really intend to speak about her, but she comes up a lot, namely Dorothy Day. I don't know if you know Dorothy Day as well over here, but with Peter Morin, the founder of the Catholic worker movement. She's now up for canonization. Please God, she will be canonized one day. But Dorothy Day was bothered by something in the 1950s. Namely, a distinction between what she called a commandments spirituality for the laity and a counsels spirituality for the clergy and religious. What does that mean? Well, the laity, God love them, their job is to follow the basic, commandments, the 10 commandments. That's what the laity can handle. So, don't kill anybody, don't steal, don't commit adultery, honor, go to Mass, don't swear, And that's good. If the laity can live up to that, God bless them. And then she said there was this counsel spirituality for the athletes, for the priests and religious and the clerics. And the counsel, of course they should follow the 10 commandments. That's taken for granted. But then above and beyond those, you got the counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And that's what the real spiritual athletes are meant to follow. Well, Dorothy Day, of course, who was a laywoman, hated that. I thought that was a wrong-headed distinction. No, there's a distinction indeed between laity and clergy. But in terms of spirituality, the laity are called just as much as the clergy to a counsels spirituality, to live in their own distinctive way, but truly poverty, chastity, and obedience. Only then, she thought, would the laity achieve the spiritual level that the Lord wanted them to have. Now, as she intuited, that was an unpopular position in the 1950s. But I think, everybody, it's very fair to say it comes to full expression at the Second Vatican Council. There's the universal call to holiness. And mind you, not low level, let's just do the basics holiness, but holiness all the way. The commandments, yes, and the counsels. And see, her intuition, again, borne out by Vatican II, was when the laity live out the evangelical counsels fully, then they will truly transform the world. See, mind you, if you're following the commandments, terrific, indispensable, of course, but that's kind of just learning the basics. If you're learning, obviously, baseball, you're the cricket over here, there must be some basic moves. Of course you don't do, X, Y, and Z if you want to be basically competent at cricket. Maybe golf I can use. We have that in common, huh? So yeah, there are certain, they call them death moves in golf, right? That if you start making these moves, you'll never hit the ball properly. You got to follow those basic commandments. But you want to be serious about golf? Then you got to move to a higher level, more complex level of discipline. Right? So the same now is true of the laity. When the laity begin living the evangelical counsels, now, Dorothy Day said, they will change the world. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. That was all the introduction. It's not going to be that long, don't worry. I just want to walk through poverty, chastity, and obedience, especially as lived by the laity. So first of all, poverty. Now, right away, let me just be clear. I'm not saying that all lay people should live the poverty of a Carthusian monk or of a Franciscan friar, or a Benedictine sister. There's a uniqueness to the religious form of poverty. But are you all called to poverty? You bet. And what does that mean? I think it means, to use the language of the great spiritual teachers, East and West, it means detachment from the goods of this world. The Greek fathers called it apatheia, not apathy in a bad way, but a sort of indifference, a detachment from the goods of the world. Ignatius of Loyola, of course, calls it indifferentia, the same idea, right? Indifference, but not like I'm indifferent to things. It means I'm detached from them. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. What's the anchor of my life? It's not, and I'll use the famous Aquinas quartet here that I share a lot. It's from the very beginning of the second part of the Summa on the moral life. The great substitutes for God: wealth and honor, pleasure and power. The four things we tend to seek in place of God. The worldly goods, yes indeed, they are good. But my life must not be focused there. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. Live in a spirit of detachment from these worldly goods. That's the attitude of poverty. An image that maybe some of you who've been following me know I've used a lot before, but it's such a powerful, simple image of the wheel of fortune, the rota fortunae of the Middle Ages. The wheel of fortune is this great wheel. You see it on many of the Gothic churches as an illustration. At the top of the wheel, of course, is a king who has power. He says, regno, I'm reigning. Then as the wheel turns this way, the king has lost his crown, right? And he says, regnavi, I have reigned. Then at the bottom, there's a little poor man, a pauper, and he says, sum sine regno, I have no power. Then the wheel turns, and up here, there's someone scrambling to get the crown back. And he says, regnabo, I will reign. Well, the point is, that's life, right? That's life. The wheel turns. And everyone in this room knows it. Everyone knows it, especially the older people know it, especially, right? That whether it's wealth, power, pleasure, honor, any of the worldly goods, the one thing we know is the wheel is going to turn. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down, sometimes I'm losing, sometimes I'm winning wealth, honor, pleasure, or power, right? The point is, don't live on the rim of the wheel. And every spiritual teacher affirms this. Don't live on the rim of the wheel. Rather, go back to the image. There's the circle. In the middle of it is a depiction of Christ. The same yesterday, today, and forever. Christ, who links us to the eternity of God. Don't live on the rim of the wheel. Live in the center of the wheel. And then you can watch the wheel turn with a certain indifference, apatheia. That's what poverty means, I think, everybody, for everyone in the church, for laity and clergy. Now, can I illustrate this a little bit further by referring to two Englishmen, John Lennon and Thomas More? We were up at Abbey Road, by the way. A couple of days ago, we went to what you call the zebra crossing, and we did a pretty good picture, four of us walking across. I was in this McCartney's place, and people said, you have to take your shoes off. You can't have your... Anyway, we took the picture at Abbey Road. I've always loved the Beatles. But, John Lennon, who had a, let's say, complicated relationship with religion, right, and the church. But I've always been intrigued. The very end of his life, he put that album out, Double Fantasy. And on that album is a song called Watching the Wheels. Remember the line? I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round. I really love to watch them roll. I'm no longer riding on the merry-go-round, John Lennon said. Now, again, I don't know where he was. Some people suggest that toward the end of his life, he was getting more into kind of a spiritual vision of things. Maybe. But that song, that line is very interesting. I'm just sitting here watching the wheel go round and round. Well, see, that's the attitude of indifference or apatheia. I'm just watching it go round and round. Wealth, honor, pleasure, power, they come, they go. Look at Lennon, by the way, right? When he's 25, he's at the top of the wheel of fortune. He's got all four of the goods of the world in abundance. And then, he lost a lot of that when the Beatles break up and all that. Then by the 1970s, he's going through his kind of dark night of the soul. He had lost almost everything. At the end of his life, he's kind of making a comeback. Okay. But I'm just sitting there watching the wheel go round and round. I love to watch it roll because I'm no longer riding on the merry-go-round. That's it. Don't live on the rim of the wheel. Don't live on the rim of the wheel. Live in the center. Live in the place of Christ. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. I'd stay with Lennon for a second. One of the spiritual masters teach this clearly. One of the worst places to be on the wheel is not the bottom. It's the top. Right? Because when you got wealth, pleasure, honor, and power, what are you worried about? There's only one move that can happen, to go down from the top, right? Think of John Lennon, age about 25, writes this song that was turned by the engineers into this sort of chirpy, happy Beatles song. But remember the lyrics. Help, I need somebody, help. Not just anybody, help. Won't you please help me? That's John Lennon at 25, at the top of the wheel of fortune. Don't live on the rim of the wheel. Live in the center, place of poverty. Okay, I mentioned Lennon, another great Englishman, Thomas More. We've been spending a lot of time this week with Thomas More. I went to his cell, which was a huge privilege. Went to his tomb. We were at the Inns of Court last night where he was received, I guess, as a attorney. So the week has been kind of filled with the spirit of More. More at the height of his worldly powers. Wealth, man, a lot of it in his mansion in Chelsea. Pleasure, sure, he had access to all the goods, food and drink and so on of the world. Power, yeah, after the king, maybe the most powerful man in the realm. Honor, yes, one of the most honored people in the country, indeed in all of Europe. He had wealth, pleasure, power, honor all the way. But when you read the life of More, what do you see? He didn't live on the rim of the wheel. All that time, yes, even when he was at the top of the wheel of fortune, wearing the hair shirt, reminding himself all the time of the fleeting quality of the goods of this world. So that when the awful moment came, when More was stripped of all four of those things. When I was in his cell the other day, cold, looking out those little slits in the wall at the river and imagining this great man stripped of all four of those things, 15 months in that prison cell, and then facing execution. That's someone who sought first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. That's someone who lived his whole life in the center of the wheel of fortune. That's what it means, I think, everybody, to live in poverty. Can I make it just concrete for a second? Because I know this can stay at the level of abstraction. Oh yeah, I should be detached from material things. How much do you give to the poor every year? I like the biblical category of tithing, and I try to follow it. 10%. Figure out what you make every year. 10% you should give to the poor, give to the church, give to a charity, whatever it is. Oh yeah, I'm detached from my money, my wealth. Really? Well, show me. And the church gives a very concrete way to do that. Here's one that was said to me many years ago. I try to follow it poorly, but I try. Find something you want to buy and that you can afford, but then take the next level down. Whether it's a car, it's a stereo, it's clothes, whatever it is. I want that. I could afford it, but I'm going to take the next level down and then give that difference to the poor. That's when it becomes a reality. That line from Leo the 13th haunts me. It's from the Rerum Novarum, the first of the great papal encyclicals on the social life. Pope Leo said this: when the demands of necessity and propriety have been met in your life, the rest of your possessions belong to the poor. Think about that for a second. That's a really challenging line. When the demands of necessity, so I'm caring for my family, my needs have been met, and propriety, which, can be broadly interpreted, I suppose. But when those have been met in your life, okay, then the rest of your possessions belong to the poor. I like the silence right now in the room because I find that, look, I'm guilty. I'm guilty as charged. That whenever I hear that line, I realize, boy, I don't live to that degree. But that was Leo XIII at the beginning of the Catholic social teaching tradition. Anyway, those are a lot of spiritual teachings we could use to concretize the call to poverty. All right. Chastity. First of all, I hope it's clear the distinction between chastity and celibacy. So priests and religious live a celibate life, but chastity is a broader term, of course. Chastity refers to living one's sexual life in an upright way, to live one's sexual life properly. Now, what does that mean? I'll state it very simply and very clearly, I hope. It means to bring the whole of your sexual life under the aegis of love. Now, we heard Brendan beautifully cite Thomas Aquinas, who with typical scholastic pith described love not as a feeling. Feelings come and go. They're like the wheel of fortune. Feelings, sometimes they're up, sometimes they're down. Don't live on the rim of that wheel either. Love is to will the good of the other. As other. So if I'm just willing your good because it'll redound to my benefit, I'm not really loving you. I'm using you. It's an indirect egotism, right? But to love is to break out of the black hole of our own egotism. You know how a black hole draws everything, including light, into itself. Well, that's the move of the sinful soul. So love is to break the power of that black hole, to will the good of the other. Now, what would our sexual lives look like if they are truly, in every detail, under the aegis of love? I would suggest they look like what the church teaches in regard to sexuality. What are the twin ends of sex? We say unity and procreation. Why those two and why those two together? Because both of them are designed to break free of the black hole of one's egotism. Unity, the spouses loving one another. Procreation, the sex giving rise and openness to life and to children. Both of those moves are the discipline of love applied to sex. That's chastity, it seems to me. That's what it means to live this evangelical counsel of chastity. That, people say, oh, the church is puritanical when it comes to sex. Not the case. We come up out of a deeply Jewish background, biblical background. The Bible is not puritanical about sex. It's not Platonic. It's not Gnostic. Early on, think of St. Irenaeus. The church said no to Gnosticism. It said no to a system that denigrated the flesh and the body. The church honors and elevates sexuality. It's not puritanical, if I can invent this term, it's caritative, caritas, love. It wants to bring all of our sexuality under the discipline of love. So let's please try to counter this claim that's common in the culture, that somehow we're body-hating, sexually, suspicious Puritans. That is not the Catholic view at all. Caritative, not puritanical. Can I give you a couple of quotes here? A little light on this thing. Let's see how. Here we go. I want to give you a couple quotes from the much maligned Humanae Vitae encyclical of St. Pope Paul VI. What I find most interesting, I'm not going to talk so much about contraception, but Paul VI as a prophet. There's a section of that letter where he prophesies, I think, about what will happen in our society when we allow sexuality to move outside the ambit of love. And let me give you a couple quotes. Let them consider how easily this course of action, so he's talking about artificial contraception here, but could open wide the way for marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards. Not much human experience is needed to be fully aware of human weakness and to understand that human beings need incentives to keep the moral law, and it's an evil thing to make it easy for them to break that law. Now, don't read that legalistically. The law he's talking about here is the law of love. All of our life, including our sexual lives, must be under the aegis of love to will the good of the other. If we start saying, well, yeah, but except here, or well, yeah, but not under those circumstances, then we put ourselves on this famously slippery slope. Keeping our sexuality under the discipline of love is the meaning of chastity. And then this one, and could you listen now with the ears of the Me Too movement, the post-Harvey Weinstein time. Listen to this quote from 1968. Another effect that gives cause for alarm is that a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman, and disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner, whom he should always surround with care and affection. Amen, as they say, all right? Well, again, listening to it with the Me Too movement ears, when the Me Too movement occurred, I remember thinking, yes, women should never be treated as the objects of someone's sexual pleasure or as objects for the manipulation of that person's power needs, etc. That happens to be the teaching of the Catholic Church from time immemorial. Never treat another human being as an object, but only as another subject whom we love. There's chastity, everybody. What would happen in this country? I think in my own country, we're, about 25% of the country is Catholic, maybe 70% Christian. What if overnight, every Christian in America, every Christian here in this country, decided to live chastely? What would happen to our marriages? What would happen to the prevalence of pornography? The statistics on pornography and the internet, to me, are just staggering. The internet is dominated by pornography. In my country, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Most of it, by the way, made in the diocese I used to be auxiliary bishop in, the Diocese of Los Angeles. What would happen to our society? What would happen to the way people are treated and used as sexual objects if every Christian decided to live chastely? You see what I mean about changing the world, changing society if we lived a counsels spirituality? Okay, much more to say about that, but I'm going to move on to the third one. Can I make this observation? The first thing I mentioned, poverty and Leo the 13th and this radical stuff, it sounds kind of left-wing, doesn't it? Well, okay, that's Catholic social teaching. Chastity stuff, boy, it sounds pretty conservative. It's Catholic social teaching. God bless it. God love it. It transcends the usual divides. Okay, last one. How are we doing on time? It's 11. What does that mean, 11? I mean, is that counting me down? I got 11 minutes. Okay. I can do it. I can do it in 11 minutes. Obedience. In the course of my priesthood, now 37 years, I have found that you talk to priests and you say, okay, the promises that we make, what's the hardest one? It's got to be celibacy, right? Most priests say, no, it's probably obedience is the hardest one. I remember it very vividly, 1986, I'm ordained to the priesthood. The ordaining bishop was Joseph Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago. I don't know if you remember that name. Died many years ago. But when you're ordained a priest, you kneel before the bishop and he's like your feudal lord. You put your hands in his hands and you say, I promise obedience to you and your successors. Extraordinary thing. I'm a kid. I'm 26 years old. I barely knew him. I had no idea who his successor would be. And yet my obedience to both of them, had an absolutely determining influence on my whole life. What I was doing at that moment, now that's in a distinctively priestly way, and I'll get to the laity, but in a distinctly priestly way, I was saying, I hereby surrender my career. Meaning that I'm in charge of my life, that I'm going to set the tone and progress and path. No, I said, I promise obedience. I'm going to listen to you and your successors. Well, that's, priestly obedience. I'll tell you another story about that. So the next cardinal was Cardinal George, and it's many years later, but he appointed me rector of the seminary in Chicago. It's called Mundelein Seminary. And I had started doing this kind of work at that point. I had been a teacher, a professor, or a writer, but I had just begun doing Word on Fire and, the wider evangelization. So he appointed me rector of the seminary. And about, 2 months later, there was a big gathering of donors. And the cardinal was there in his full regalia, the red cape and everything, and I was there. And, donors tend to be people that they'll tell you what they think pretty clearly. And this lady came up to me, and she goes, Father Barron, may I just say that this is ridiculous that you've been appointed rector of that little seminary out in the country. I mean, you're trying to evangelize the whole society, and you're pushing papers out there at this little seminary with 200 students. I just don't understand it. And I looked at her, I said, there's a man in a red cape in the next room who can answer all your questions. It's like, lady, I didn't decide this, But that to me is the beauty of the freedom of ecclesiastical obedience. So you say, this is not about me. Now, so what about the laity? So speaking a little bit more widely, your life is not about you. It's one of the most basic statements, I think, of the whole spiritual tradition. It's your life, yes, indeed. You bring something very distinctive, that's the corny cliche, but, that God has made you precisely. True, that's all true. But your life is not about you. Your life is meant to serve God's purposes. In the measure that you surrender to God's purposes, now you come alive, and now you begin to transform the world the way God wants you to. But can I make a distinction, everybody, that's so important, between heteronomy and theonomy? So heteronomy just means someone else becomes the law of my life. No one likes that. Someone else bossing me around. Someone else tell me what to do. We don't like heteronomy. But see, theonomy means God has become the norm of my life. God's become the law of my life. And when you surrender to God, you're not surrendering to an oppressive other. Your countryman, Christopher Hitchens, when he was, all the rage, the new atheism. To be religious is to live in this cosmic North Korea where this, tyrant is always surveying your life and bossing you around. That is not at all what we understand by God. God is not competing with us. God is not dominating us. But rather, when we surrender to God, we find ourselves. There's the burning bush, right? That's on fire. It's luminous, but not consumed. As God gets close to us, we become more beautiful, and we're not destroyed. We're enhanced. That's what we're talking about with obedience. When I obedire, right? When I listen to the higher voice of God, I come alive. A distinction I've used now, I get it from Hans Urs von Balthasar, but I've used it for years, between the ego drama and the theodrama. That's key to the spiritual life, I think. What's the ego drama? That's the drama that I'm writing, I'm producing, I'm directing, I'm starring in. You're my bit players right now. I'm on the road in London, and it's the Bishop Robert Barron show. Well, that's all of us sinners. We tend to live in the ego drama. The theodrama, the drama that God is writing, God's directing, God is producing. He's got a role for me and for you. But the beauty is that it belongs to God and God's direction. Now that's the ticket. That's the one you want to be in, the theodrama, not the ego drama. Can I make one more Thomas More reference? My favorite movie still is Man for All Seasons, the great film about Thomas More, which I saw as a kid of probably 15 and watched every year of my life. I found I was doing these stand-ups about More here, and I could just recite large parts of that movie by heart. I've watched it so many times. But there's a scene that I really love. It's toward the beginning of the movie, not one of the really famous scenes, but it's More and Richard Rich, right? The man who eventually will do him in, will testify against him. But at the beginning of the movie, Rich is this ambitious young, Cambridge graduate. He's hanging around Moore because he wants a big position at court. And so finally, after all this waiting, Moore says, I have a job for you, Rich. It's got a home and a decent salary. What is it? And, Moore says, there's an opening in the school. And Rich is just devastated. A teacher? You want me to be a teacher? And Moore says, you might be a good teacher, even a great one. And Richard Rich, of course, his name is beautiful, isn't it? Richard Rich. Talk about someone at the top of the wheel of fortune. You might be a great teacher. And if I were, who would know it? He says, with that classic ego-dramatic language, isn't it? It's his drama. It's his show. And Moore very patiently says, yourself, your friends, your pupils, God, not a bad public, that. But that's theodramatic language, isn't it? So the question for everybody in this room, whom are we playing to? The audience for the ego drama? Or are we playing for God? We've climbed the ladder of success, as they say, only to find it's up against the wrong wall. I've spent my whole life climbing, or the greasy pole, to use the image from Disraeli. I'm climbing the ladder, but I was meant to be against that wall, Don't live ego-dramatically, but theo-dramatically. That's obedience. Go back to 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Old Testament, those great stories about David. When does David succeed? When he says, Lord, what should I do? Time and again, young David, Lord, what should I do? Lord, where should I go? Should I sally out against the Philistines? And Lord, when he does that, he succeeds. When does David fail? Go to that magnificent story about David and Bathsheba. That time of year when kings go on campaign, that's how the chapter opens. Yeah, and David was always on campaign. Right, that time of year when kings go on campaign, David was waking up from a long siesta on the roof of his palace. What was he doing there? Why was he doing what the Lord wanted him to do? And in that spiritually vulnerable place, he begins not obeying God, but acting like God. So David on the roof of his palace surveying and then seeing the beautiful Bathsheba and then ordering, get her, bring her. That's a beautiful example of moving from a theodramatic consciousness to an ego-dramatic consciousness. Result, the sword never left his house. That's not God being vengeful. It's just spiritual physics. From the ego drama comes nothing but trouble. From the theodrama comes my own salvation and the transformation of the world. How about, I got 1 minute and 42 seconds. Okay, I'll say two last things about this. So how do you cultivate obedience? Prayer, everybody. The great Fulton Sheen, who loved London, was here a lot in the course of his life. Fulton Sheen ended every single retreat he ever gave by recommending the Holy Hour. And how beautiful, that means an hour of prayer, if possible, before the Blessed Sacrament. Sheen wasn't listened to by my generation. We kind of forgot about Sheen. But the next generation took him in. And now seminaries across the English-speaking world, people doing the Holy Hour. That's from Sheen. I recommend it to everybody in this room. See, what is prayer? John of Damascus said, it's the raising of the mind and the heart to God. Well, see, that's what you do when you're obeying. You're obedient. You're moving out of the ego drama. You're listening to the higher voice. You can't hear it without prayer. So pray every day. Last recommendation from one of my great spiritual heroes, the Little Flower. Follow the little way. Oh, how sweet the little way. But see, we shouldn't read it that way. It's very hard-edged spirituality, the little way. The little way says, in every moment, follow the path of love. So in every moment of your day, what does it look like? What opportunity are you being given to will the good of the other? Easy to say, really hard to do, right? But think about that. If you wake up in the morning and say, okay, my goal today is not to get as much wealth, pleasure, power, and honor into my life. My goal is not to live the ego drama. My goal today is to live the life of love every moment, willing the good of the other. Because here's the thing about why I say it's hard-edged spirituality. Who is God but love? That's God's name. That's all God is. Thomas More, God is love right through. That's all God is. Therefore, when we, even in the simplest way, perform the acts of love, we are obeying the higher voice of God. We're living theodramatically. Of course, Mother Teresa, who took her name in religion from Thérèse of Lisieux, when I visited her cell, this was amazing. We were filming in Calcutta, and you go to Mother Teresa's cell, as you'd expect, pretty simple. There was like a little picnic table in the corner, where she ate. Maybe one chair and this little bed. There was one decoration in it. It was a photograph of the little flower. Because Mother Teresa, picking up on the little way, said, "Don't worry about doing great things." Great things. That's ego-dramatic language. Great things. Wealth, power, pleasure, honor, my audience. Boy, am I doing great things. Who cares? Who cares? Don't worry about that. Rather, do the littlest things with great love. Now we're talking theodramatically. Now we're operating out of real obedience. What if every Christian in this country decided tonight to live in obedience to that higher voice? Trust me, you changed the world. God bless everybody. I got 33 seconds. I did it. God bless you.